Now we are going to talk about some key religious and political groups and people of Jesus' time. So I want you to type in your notes, key religious, political groups, and persons in Jesus' time. Okay? And the reason why we're studying these, or why it's important for you to know these, is because Jesus often refers to these individuals, and so you need to understand who they are in order for you to understand Jesus's stories or the information that we're going to be reading. So you can't make meaning of a story if you don't really understand the roles that people play. So the first group of people evident in Jesus' time are known as the priestly caste. I'm going to remember these just to make it easier, okay? So the priestly class were men of the Jewish community chosen to be the go-between between God and the people. Offering sacrifices in the temple. So you can see that the Jewish people didn't feel that they could directly approach God. They approached God through a priest. These men were often chosen from a certain Jewish tribe, so one of the 12 tribes. Don't mind my spelling, or my typing, sorry girls. And because they were highly respected in the community. However, it's a trick of this idea of being highly respected. Respectability often meant having wealth or social status. So typically when you think of respectability, you might have thought prior to me saying this that they lived an exemplary sort of holy life, and that's why the community chose them to be a priest. But in fact, oftentimes the priests were chosen, as I just said, because they had wealth or social status. So the priest, this priestly caste is a group, that's what that word means, became exclusive, and therefore the priests were often disliked by the common people. So you can kind of get a sense that perhaps those in the priestly class had a sort of arrogance about them. Even though they were the go-between for God, there was some looking down upon the common person, and therefore the common person didn't feel like maybe that the priests were approachable or that they understood their way of life, and so they didn't have great like for the priests. Within the priestly class was a special role of the high priest. Was the person in charge of the whole priestly caste often was chosen by, who do you think? The correct answer is political leaders. And lived a lavish lifestyle. And you can imagine why he lived a lavish lifestyle. Oftentimes, political leaders wanted to stay on his good side since he had so much influence with the Jewish people. So perhaps his lavish lifestyle was in part due to the fact that maybe political leaders contributed to his lavish lifestyle. We don't know that for sure, but you could make some assumptions about that. Okay? Okay, so that's the first group. The second group that we're going to talk about is the Sadducees. It has 2 D's and 2 E's. Okay? The Sadducees were the wealthy Jewish class. I'm going to say they were the upper class. Some were priests. And they had great political power because of their money. They were very conservative in their religious beliefs, meaning they followed the Torah literally. So they didn't, when I say literally, that means that they followed the words word for word. They didn't make interpretations. They didn't take things into context. We talked about that at the beginning of the year. And something else that differentiated them is that they did not believe in resurrection after death, which is something kind of important. Okay, the next group, Pharisees. Maybe you recognize this group if you've done any scripture studies, because Jesus often refers to the Pharisees. Wait, I want us to go back to one thing about the Sadducees, which is kind of important. The power base of this group was in Jerusalem, because Sadducees were devoted to the temple and temple sacrifice. And you can imagine why, because some of them were priests, okay? So now we get into the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were often rivals of the Sadducees, and less strict in their adherence, to the law, to all the laws. If you remember, the Mosaic law from Moses, but also remember I told you there were some 600 and some laws that the Jews had to follow that were given to them by God. Okay, so they were more liberal in their interpretation of the law, and therefore developed some oral laws. No, I wouldn't say oral laws, but oral translations of the laws to help people, to help their people, the Jewish people, follow the laws in their daily life. And you can imagine these oral translations of the laws were passed on from one generation to the next. Pharisees had a better relationship with the common people. I'm going to say the common Jewish people so you know who I'm talking about. But all of this is about Jewish people because this is who we're studying. And the Jews, I should say the Judaism of today is derived from the Pharisee group. Then we have a group called the Zealots. These were Jews that believed in a Jewish independent nation, and therefore thought that being faithful to the covenant meant overthrowing the Roman power through the use of violence. Now, the Zealots probably would have been attracted to Jesus at first because he was a strong leader and he seemed like he had a lot of power, but Jesus definitely taught nonviolence, so you could see how over time they would not have been as favorable towards Jesus because his approach was very different than their own. Then we had a group called the Essenes. These were Jewish people who believed that to be faithful to the covenant, the law, and when I say the law, whenever I'm speaking about the law, I'm talking about the Mosaic law, all the laws that God gave Moses. And that was part of the agreement of the Jewish people that in order for God to protect them, give them land, make them a great nation, give them descendants as numerous as the stars, that they had to follow the laws, okay? So the Jewish people who believed, so the Essenes were Jewish people that believed to be faithful to the covenant. Sorry, I was thinking that the law had to be followed by removing themselves from city life, like Jerusalem, and going out into the desert to be faithful Jews. And I like to think of the Essenes, how I remember this is, I remember E for exit, which is what the Essenes start with, okay? And then we have one last group that I'm going to talk about, and that's the tax collectors. Because I don't have time to type because I'm almost out of time. The tax collectors were Jewish men that collected the taxes from the Jews who had to pay a tax to the Roman government, but then also had to pay a tax to their own governing body of the Jews. Primarily, it was called the temple tax. So they had to pay a tax to the Jewish priests, and to the Romans, so they were doubly taxed, and these tax collectors were put in charge of collecting this money, and they were often despised by their own people because this was a double hardship of having two taxes to